Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize winner, former head of the Middle East Bureau of the New York Times, edged out over the Iraq War, is a very considerable expert on the Middle East. And we're very lucky that he's joined us again this evening here on the Mother of All Talk Shows to survey the scene. Let's start in Gaza, Chris. We've both been across this course many times before, but there's a particular frenzy and scale to the current slaughter, even by comparison with previous ones, wouldn't you say?
Yes, it really, at this point, rivals the massive ethnic cleansing campaigns of 1948 and 1949, when 750,000 Palestinians were pushed from their homes, a series of massacres, Deir Yassin, hundreds of Palestinians killed, including many women and children. Again, another massive ethnic cleansing campaign in 1967, when Israel seized what was left of independent Palestinian territory, about 22% of Palestinian land in the West Bank and Gaza. It rivals that in terms of its brutality. The noises out of Jerusalem on the part of the Netanyahu government, as well as the long calls for the removal of Palestinians, not only from the West Bank and Gaza, but from inside Israel, the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. That has been a central tenet of many of the senior ministers in this far-right government, the most extreme government in Israel's history. I don't think the word genocide at this point is inappropriate. Cutting off food, water, medicine, fuel. Hospitals now are on the cusp of, some have already shut down. This is just absolutely appalling. And of course, what's even more appalling is the complicity of the international community, or let's call certainly Washington and Europe. Washington, as the Biden administration has vetoed, as you know, the calls for ceasefire, even a pause to get supplies in. It's really absolutely stunning. And I think it's clear that either all or part of the Gaza Strip will be bombed into rubble. The northern area, the area where 1.1 million Palestinians have had to evacuate, is being smashed, pounded day in and day out. I was in Sarajevo during the war. We were being hit with about 300 or 400 shells a day, but the numbers of dead and wounded were nothing, such as we see in Gaza, hundreds, 500 a day, 700 a day, and then thousands of wounded. Of course, we have to always remember that half of the residents in Gaza, roughly 2.3 million people, over half of them are children. So I'm like you, extremely upset as somebody who I spent 7 years covering Gaza, months of my life in Gaza, but I'm also it's jaw-dropping on the part of Washington and European capitals as they sit there and do nothing in front of this slaughter. Indeed, if you try and speak out against it, you're censored. You're attacked as an anti-Semite. We've gone from the absurdity of criticizing Israel as a form of anti-Semitism to criticizing genocide as a form of anti-Semitism.
We'll come to the Western governments in a minute, but let's try and drill down on the Netanyahu government itself and on the political situation in the country. Before this happened, Netanyahu was in a considerable degree of trouble. There were mass demonstrations every Saturday night against him, and almost all of the liberal chattering classes in the West were behind those demonstrations and calling for Netanyahu to step down. And now, with one leap, he's free with a blank check in his pocket from these same Western governments that wanted rid of him just a few weeks ago. Is this frenzy of violence connected to the instability, insecurity of the Netanyahu government?
I would say it's connected to the incompetence of the Netanyahu government. Remember, they moved significant numbers of troops over to the West Bank to protect settlers who were having, I think, a Purim festival or some kind of festival in the West Bank. So the whole border area along Gaza was unmanned, basically, by soldiers. It's why Hamas fighters so easily entered military outposts all up and down the security barrier that Israel had built. And then, of course, a huge intelligence failure. So they didn't even see it coming, this massive incursion. So I would say it's rooted in the gross incompetence on the part of the Netanyahu government, who now is polling, by the way, at about 22%. But the attacks by the Hamas fighters have essentially given license. Now, you mentioned the demonstrations against Netanyahu. It's important to remember that none of those protesters were calling for equal rights for Palestinians. The Palestinians had been completely erased from their consciousness. And 7 years in and out of Gaza, it became apparent to all of us who were reporting that you can't. I mean, these people have been locked inside this concentration camp, let's call it for what it is, for 22 years. Many of those fighters who burst through those barriers had never been outside of Gaza their entire life. And you can't, and this was a theme that we kept reporting, although we were ignored, you can't brutalize these people week in and week out, month in and month out, year in and year out, and not expect a response. I'm not defending it, but we have to understand it. And to understand is not to condone. It was completely predictable. And this was Netanyahu's policy. After the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, Oslo is another issue, whether it would have worked or not. I knew Rabin. I covered him, actually, no Bibi. And but there was an attempt on the part of Rabin and his government to reach some kind of accommodation through Oslo. With the removal of Rabin, and Bibi is a creation of the Israel lobby in the United States, funded massively by AIPAC. In fact, when he was running against Rabin, all sorts of American campaign advisors were there, demonizing Rabin at Bibi Netanyahu's rallies. Rabin was being dressed up in effigy. There was an effigy of Rabin in a Nazi uniform. And then, of course, one of Bibi's followers assassinated Rabin. But at that point, it snuffed out any attempt at accommodation. And Bibi and the far right, their policy was grind them under their boot. So even when they had, in the March of Return, 2018, you had nonviolent, Gandhian-like protests, people approaching the fence and being gunned down by Israeli snipers. And many of those who were targeted, as you know, were medics, were press, quite consciously. And I've been in a lot of war. When you look through a sniper scope, you can see the face of the person that you obliterate, which is why I don't buy in to now what Israel admits is the quote-unquote accidental death of Shireen Abu Akleh from Al Jazeera. So this is a complete backfiring or a complete collapse of the Netanyahu doctrine of crush them, mow the lawn, as they say, periodically just bomb and shell Gaza. Remember, we're talking about attacking a people in Gaza that has no army, no navy, no air force, no artillery units, no mechanized units, no command and control. I really bristle at the idea of the word war. This isn't a war. This is indiscriminate slaughter. I am perfectly willing to condemn Hamas's rockets, Palestine Islamic Jihad, those rockets into Israel as a war crime because they're indiscriminate. I'm even willing to condemn the killing of civilians by Hamas as a war crime. But if you really want to get cold-blooded and tally up the numbers, Israel's killing dwarfs anything that Hamas has been able to do, including, of course, this attack that left 1,400 Israelis dead. So, where is it going to go? I think that, there are reports that Israel will flood the tunnels rather than trying to fight within them. But that, of course, would kill all the hostages. but I wouldn't exclude it as an Israeli policy. They have sacrificed throughout their history hostages, hostage takers in the past have been slaughtered along with the hostages. There are some reports that out of the kibbutzim, this may have been what happened, that they in fact were not killed by Hamas, but the Israeli IDF went in there and obliterated these houses where Israelis were being held hostage. I don't know. I'm not on the ground. I'm not reporting it. But it certainly fits with my own coverage of Israel. And we have seen cases where Israeli soldiers have been seized by Hamas, taken into Gaza, and rather than rescue those soldiers, they just obliterate the entire spot, killing hundreds of people along with the soldier where they're being held.
Let's turn to these Western governments then. We know about war. We also know about politicians. Politicians in countries that have elections usually have to be sensitive to what appear to be movements in public opinion. It would seem to me undeniable that in virtually all, if not all, Western countries, there has been a massive movement of public sympathy for the Palestinian people, accentuated rapidly over the last 17 days by social media pictures and footage, which is difficult to look at, especially for people like you and me who know these families, who know these towns and villages. But those who are looking at these pictures and videos are being moved. And you can see that, you can feel that. And yet, your government and my government are absolutely ironclad, side by side with Netanyahu. What's that all about?
Money. They're bought off. The Israel lobby and Al Jazeera did a great series, both on the UK and the US. It was an undercover reporter who reported that actually the UK investigation got aired. The Israel lobby Israel blocked the broadcasting of the investigation into the Israel lobby in the United States. Pirated versions were put up on Electronic Intifada and other sites, and it's certainly worth watching because it just shows how captive the American political class is to the money that is poured into their campaigns. And then also they will use those resources to take down candidates. Cynthia McKinney would be a good example, that get up and criticize Israeli war crimes. Rashida Tlaib, who is of Palestinian descent, has been a target of the Israel lobby every time she runs. And we're talking about millions and millions of dollars. So these governments are not responsive in any way to public opinion. They're not responsive to international law. They're not responsive to Genocide, this insane book that Samantha Power wrote, A Problem from Hell, where the U.S. suddenly is held up as the country that should intervene, these humanitarian interventionists who brought us the wars in the Middle East and brought us the breakdown of Libya and Syria and everywhere else, and of course have fueled the insanity in the Ukraine, are completely silent now. I mean, and the genocidal campaign on the part of Israel is far greater in terms of magnitude, daily magnitude, than anything the Russians have done or anything that any of these regimes, Gaddafi, I knew Gaddafi, I think you did too, any of these regimes in the Middle East did. So the hypocrisy is rank, and the fundamental problem is the Palestinians don't have power, and they're virtually friendless, and the Middle East regimes are very two-faced about their support for the Palestinian. It's skin deep. There's, of course, strong resentment towards Israel and what it's doing, as there should be. And that has seen King Abdullah, who I also knew his father very well, went to school with King Abdullah. So they have to respond. But these people are essentially lackeys of Western countries, in particular the United States. Jordan would be a good example of that. In Saudi Arabia, they'll make the right noises, but have long, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has long betrayed the Palestinians. So they're really friendless, powerless, and because of that, they are being slaughtered en masse. We're talking about no water, we're running out of water running out of food, fuel. You can't pump water. I mean, water's always been a problem, as you know, in Gaza, even before, because the Israelis in both the West Bank and Gaza siphon off the aquifers. So clean drinking water, it was a huge issue even before this attack. There's just, there are very, very few. There may be volunteers from Iraq, we hear, and they're the only real alliances they have are with Hezbollah on the northern border of Israel and Lebanon, and Iran and Syria. But of course, they talk about a wider war. Well, that's already begun. Israel has carried out two airstrikes against the airports in Damascus and Aleppo in order to prevent supplies, military supplies, getting to Hezbollah. How far will this go? I don't know. I mean, once you open that Pandora's box of war, and I spent 20 years covering conflicts all over the globe, you don't control it. It controls you. So this could go horribly wrong in terms of a regional conflict. But the myopia of the Netanyahu government, I mein, look, they're calling Palestinians Nazis. This is just utter insanity. I don't see it. I mean, if the U.S. wants a pause on the invasion because they want to get their air defense missile systems in place, fearing assaults. Quite correctly, there already have been assaults on American bases in Iraq and Syria, and that could become more serious. But this really could go, if Israel starts striking deep within Lebanon, Lebanon has quite an arsenal of missiles that, I mean, let's be clear, these rockets from Palestinians they're kind of fireworks. I mean, they're lethal, but to a very small degree. They're very inaccurate. But that's not true with the missile capability of Hezbollah that could really target infrastructure within Israel and cause quite a bit of damage. And then if that begins to happen, there's no telling. Remember, Israel is the one nuclear power within the Middle East. Do they drop some kind of nuclear device on Iran? I mean, none of that is out of the realm of possibility, given the demented figures within the Netanyahu cabinet who all come out of that old Kahana. Meir Kahana was a far-right rabbi. He was in Israel when I was there and was actually banned because of his extremism. But these people are all the children of Kahana.
How does this all play into the election season in the United States? There's bipartisanship in your country and in mine. So no one party is going to take advantage, but might one candidate or other break from the pack and seek to use the current real grave danger of a wider regional war with the American Navy right in the middle of it?
I doubt it. I mean, read Bobby Kennedy. He's repeating every talking point of the far right. The only candidate is my friend Cornel West, but he has no real political traction. And you have to look at the media coverage in the United States, which is slavishly pro-Israel and gives voice to Israeli victims. I, as a reporter, those victims should be heard, but so should the Palestinian victims. Which there's a kind of very marginal or superficial attempt to acknowledge a Palestinian voice, so it's not completely ignored, and the bias is not completely exposed. But the 95% plus of the coverage is essentially Israeli propaganda, and the two parties, by the ruling class, within the two parties, is essentially completely backing up the Israelis. In fact, doing their dirty work to prevent a ceasefire. Well, that's the thing I find the most staggering, that the Biden administration, which has the capacity to pressure Israel because we're a huge arms supporter, $3 billion a year in arms, and of course now more arms because the stocks of the Israelis are being depleted. It has the power to stop it, and it won't.
Ukraine, remember that? the ease with which they have turned the page is quite bewildering. I mean,
Well,
Ukraine feels like
Ukraine
a
isn't
decade
going very
ago
well.
instead
Ukraine's
of
a
2 weeks
disaster.
ago.
Yeah, but Ukraine's a disaster. It is a complete disaster, as many of us who, have covered war understood. It's a complete stalemate. It's just, what's happening is Ukrainians are essentially bleeding to death. Their country is being destroyed for U.S. global interests, which is the isolation of Putin and the degradation or degrading the Russian army. But that was completely predictable. So yeah, of course even before October 7th, the coverage in the United States of Ukraine had significantly dropped off because it wasn't good news. That cheerleading for the valiant Ukrainians who were about to push the Russian Empire back over the border, it didn't really work anymore, given the facts on the ground, which even the media couldn't cover up.